Next speaker got a mention from Suchija there. It is Ruth Shapiro. Do come and join me at the front, Ruth. Yeah. And there's a microphone there. Ruth Shapiro is a thought leader in this area and a highly distinguished academic with degrees from Stanford, Harvard, George Washington University, and the University of Michigan. I hope I haven't missed any out there, but it's a pretty... Falls enough. Dr. Shapiro's academic work was in international development in Asia, but she describes herself as a born-again capitalist, believing that investment from family companies and philanthropists can move the dial when it comes to solving some of the world's most difficult problems. In 2013, to this end, Ruth co-founded the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, CAPS, which is based here in Hong Kong. It's a non-profit that works across 18 Asian countries and territories. It's independent, action-orientated research and advisory organization committed to maximizing private resources for doing good. One of the CAP's flagship policy studies is the Doing Good Index, which has been going for 11 years. It looks at factors that encourage or impede the giving or receiving of a private social investment. Ruth, let's start with, how do we know that philanthropy is growing in Asia? Because I know you've looked at this, so maybe you can give us some statistics on that.
Statistics, no.
No.
Unlike Pax Trito, who memorize really great statistics, I'm bad at that.
Okay.
But what I can say is there is more wealth in Asia, and I will just say he was right in the statistics that he said. There's more wealth in Asia, and surprisingly, although the United States is kind of held up as best in class in philanthropy, the notion of connectivity to community, helping one's family, one's village, one's clan, that is integral and in the part of the DNA of this part of the world. So this idea that people helping people is somehow new, it's not new at all. It goes back thousands of years in this part of the world. So what's new is the amount of money that exists now in Asia. So the idea that it would be deployed toward communities, toward helping people succeed and flourish, that just seems commonsensical. In the United States, we had, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies who did that, but it didn't become part of de rigueur. When you got rich, you became philanthropic. I would say it is somewhat de rigueur now in the US, but in Asia, it's always been that there is this sense that I'm embedded in this community and I'm giving back, right? And why is the Tanoto Foundation so active in Indonesia? Because that is where Sukanto Tanoto made the bulk of his money, got started, grew up, and feels connected to in a profound way. So I would just say, although we don't know, surprisingly, the only country in Asia that really tracks philanthropic giving, where foundations and charitable contributions have to be reported, is mainland China. And there we know exactly how much money people are giving. In the rest of Asia, including Hong Kong, you don't have to say. So we don't know exactly how much philanthropic capital is flowing, but we do know there's more money in the region, and there is a default sense among families, I'm going to help. So that is why we think philanthropy is growing.
You mentioned that one of the things about philanthropy in Asia is this connection to community and giving back to your local community. What are some of the other differences, say, with philanthropists in the US and Europe?
Well, let me mention a few. Pax Trito, did a commercial for his book, so I will do a commercial for my book, which is called Pragmatic Philanthropy, and it can be downloaded for free from Amazon. It's open source. Essentially, he's right. There is not that much old money in this part of the world. So who's the philanthropist? For the most part, it's business, right? And in fact, 85% of all small, medium, and large companies in Asia are family dominated. And those business leaders, they can push back, like James says, a little bit on government, but they want to stay in business. They want to continue in business, and they want to find win-win situations. So first, the role of, there is, I suppose, much more of an ambiguity between many Asian foundations, the family's personal philanthropy, and the company. In Hong Kong, there are a few foundations that are very separate from the company, and James Chen runs one of the premier examples. The Tanato Foundation is an extraordinary case because that family decided to separate RGE, the business, from the Tanato Foundation. But in the overwhelming majority of cases, and I'm sure they would agree, the philanthropy runs through the corporates, through the company. So that's a major difference. And let me just point to the earlier point about the WEF study, and ClimateWorks also has a study that says climate philanthropy from Asian foundations is very low. ClimateWorks says 2%, WEF says 6%, but I think it's the wrong question, because except for some foundations, like the Tanoto Foundation, there are no Carnegies, Ford, Gates, Rockefeller foundations in Asia. There are big money, but look at the example of India. The richest man in India is the Ambani family. There's one foundation, the Reliance Foundation. That is the corporate foundation. That is the family foundation. So I would say the connection between the family's business and their philanthropy is profound in Asia. What are the ramifications of that? One, they do want to work aligned with government, and we can talk about that in depth a little bit more, although Paxachito gave some terrific answers for that. The second big difference, I would say, is, and I guess that being a kind of an American transplant in Asia, I have this comparative view. So it always strikes me when I go back to the US and I hear commercials for some of the big foundations, and they say things like, we are X foundation, and we're here to solve the world's biggest problems, which is a certain degree of hubris, I think. I mean, like, really? Compared to what? All the governments? You're going to solve the world's biggest problems? Or they say, we're here to solve for climate change, or we're here to solve for, the lack of adequate vaccines. That's fine. That's good. But what it does is it puts the problem right in the front. That is the goal, to solve for that problem. In Asia, what you hear a lot more is, we are connected to a community, to a place, and we want to help them. So it puts the people and the community in the center of what's being done. And that happened at Tanato, right? What did the people in Indonesia needed? They needed help with stunting. They needed help with education, and that drove the decision making. And I actually kind of love that. It's the original design thinking. That is design thinking, which is very trendy now, of putting the people at the center. That's the default strategy in this part of the world.
But does that also mean that Asian family foundations are less likely to invest in fighting global challenges like
Absolutely,
climate change?
yes. So we have to think that in Asia, except for Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and Singapore, and you could say Hong Kong, but it's a city, the rest of the countries in Asia are emerging markets, which means there's needs at home. And as was said earlier, Asia as a whole is on track to achieve 0 of the SDGs as a whole. So there's plenty of need at home. And so why would somebody in the Philippines give money to Laos? There's plenty of need in the Philippines. And that's where the companies are. And that's where they grew up. And that's where their connections are. So I think it makes sense, right? Also, according to the Doing Good Index, which I encourage everyone to read, and we have a great microsite attached to it, many countries are now putting in barriers that kind of push back on foreign money coming in and make it more difficult for domestic money to go out.
So there are actually government levers being put in place to encourage giving at home.
At home, right. China is a great example of this. So China has made it much more difficult to send money in, almost impossible to send philanthropic capital out. In fact, we have a donor in Shenzhen that makes screens, big screens for multimedia screens. And they wanted to make a donation to us. And we said, well, we have a new office. We really need this AV equipment. And he said, well, he's 10 miles away, really. He said, I don't think I can do that. I said, can I just send somebody over to pick it up? He said, oh, no, we can't do that. So we can't, theirs is not much of a flow, even though Hong Kong is part of China increasingly. But so governments are pushing back. China, because of the rules and regulations it's put into place, has actually created more domestic giving to compensate, to be commensurate with the amount of foreign funding that is no longer going in. The rest of the countries in Asia have not been able to do that.
We've talked about the Doing Good Index, which you set up. Why did you set it up, and what impact does it have?
So when I was starting CAPS, we did 30 case studies on really great nonprofits and social enterprises to kind of figure out how they were working. We wanted to make the case that, well, we wanted to see if there was a justification to create the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, which I co-founded and run. And let me just say, we are a research organization. Our mission is to increase the quality and quantity of all types of private social investment in the region. But we do it from the point of view of Asia. We try to understand what makes people tick in this part of the world, what's going to motivate them, what works on the ground in this part of the world. And that's why some of our donors are here today, and I'm very grateful to them, because we try to say, okay, the United States might be doing one thing, but is that the right model or strategy in Thailand? Not necessarily. So we did this work, and I went around and I interviewed probably about 60 ultra-high net worth people, and I said, why don't you give more in Asia? Many of them, they give to Harvard, they give to Oxford, they give to Cambridge, they give to Room to Read and the Nature Conservancy. But what about the organizations here? Actually, there are 10,000 nonprofits in Hong Kong, more than 10,000. And surprisingly, the only answer that I got absolutely across the board, whether it was Korea, Indonesia, India, was, I don't trust the local organizations to receive the money. There have been scandals. Local nonprofits are not good about telling their story and being transparent. So many business leaders say, well, I can kind of do this myself. I don't need to work through a nonprofit. I have a distribution system.
I can just write a check for...
No, I can go into the community myself. My operations are there. I have a distribution system there. I'm working there. I can just do the work. So many corporate foundations become operating foundations. No need to work through these other organizations. If you think about it, our thinking about society, very Western thinking, is there's government, there's the public sector, and there's civil society. Okay, so if the third sector is not getting as much funding, the third leg of the stool, which is what people refer to, falls away, the stool falls down, right? So that is not the model that's necessarily in play here. So what we wanted to understand was, how do you build trust? How do you make it more likely that philanthropic capital can flow? And so we created the Doing Good Index to really look at the factors that enable or impede the giving and receiving of private social investment. And the fourth iteration of it came out in 2024. It's an extraordinarily robust study. We polled 2,300 about social delivery organizations, which is incredible because it takes an hour to fill out the survey. So to get 2,300 from across Asia is a testament to my team, some of whom are sitting here, and also to our partners who help us collect the data. And we poll experts, and that's how we create this index. And interestingly, we have been invited more and more and more as our kind of our brand increases and the notoriety of the Doing Good Index increases. Now we're being asked by governments regularly to come and say, how can we move up? How can we improve? What can we do to make it easier for philanthropic capital to flow? And I just want to mention, when you talk about differences, and it gets back to James' point, in Asia, most business people are the philanthropists. They don't just stop working and then become philanthropists. They keep working and become philanthropists. So they fund aligned with government, as Paxochito said. So what we say to government is, why put up barriers? These guys are going to fund the things you care about. They're going to fund aligned with what your priorities are. So double down, make it easier. And then more money will flow to education, to health, to climate.
But what about the trust issue? How do you increase that?
Well, if the government's involved, then people are much more likely to trust, right? And so we actually did a study on public-private partnerships for social good. Those are on the increase. That's what you were talking about with your stunting work. When the private sector says to the government, let's work hand in hand from the get-go in solving this problem. If the government's involved, then you're helping to kind of mitigate that trust problem. But governments are putting in place mechanisms, and the Doing Good Index tells you which ones they are, to increase transparency and accountability such that trust increases.
Now, I said in my introduction to you that you described yourself as somebody who studied development and then became a born-again capitalist. So,
yes.
Can you
You like that term. Right.
It's my term. You said it. Yeah.
I said it.
Yeah, expand a little on that. You know, what was your...
So my background is in international development. I worked for consulting firms that worked with USAID and the World Bank and these kind of aid agencies. And I did my doctoral research in Indonesia. And I looked at, and it was a long time ago because as youthful as I might look, I'm really not that youthful. And I compared an education project funded by USAID, an education project funded by JICA, which is the Japanese aid agency, and an education project which was funded by both. Now, this was several decades ago, but I think that what I found is that the Japanese at that time were becoming the largest provider of overseas development assistance, ODA, and they were being criticized in the world for linking their aid with their trade. Very much criticized. It's kind of the story of, in Casablanca, where the inspector says, I'm shocked that there's gambling going on here. See, I'm telling my age now also by quoting Casablanca. But anyway.
Great movie.
People would say, we're shocked that somehow Japan can connect its aid with its trade. But I saw, okay, if you're building a vocational training school and you're building it in the middle of nowhere, those graduates can graduate, fine, but then they still have to go to the city to get a job. If you were the Japanese aid agency and built it right next to a Mitsubishi plant, then all the graduates of that vocational training center got jobs, right? So I thought, one, that made a lot of sense. It helped Indonesia. It helped Mitsubishi. It helped the economic development of Indonesia. It was a great example. But I also think that one Mitsubishi plant that put more capital into Indonesia than the amount of philanthropic capital that went, the amount of aid and philanthropic capital that came from outside. So I do think that companies who act in enlightened self-interest can be a force for good, and that we work on that to a great extent.
And expand a little bit on this relationship between philanthropic foundations, family foundations, and work with government. I mean, overall, I think I said earlier that there's a great deal of suspicion in US philanthropy about that You don't have that suspicion.
Well, I mean, you have to think that the United States was, the United States, no matter, I don't know what's going to happen to the United States, but up until now, we have prided ourselves on being a nation of immigrants. And aside from the Native Americans, everybody came from somewhere else originally. And those people were fleeing the governments and the lack of economic opportunity to go to the United States. So whatever your political stripe is, and even if you're a kind of dyed-in-the-wool Democrat like me, you don't think when you have a problem that I'm going to somehow go to the local government to solve my problem.
So there's very deep-rooted cultural suspicion about government and state.
I wouldn't say it's suspicion. It's just kind of, I'm doing my thing. I'm going to solve my problem. I don't see the government as my solution provider. If I have a problem, I'm going to solve it. I'm going to start a nonprofit. I'm going to do something myself to figure it out. And that is very American. That is not the concept in Asia. In Asia, government is the go-to solution provider. Your kid can't get a job, you go to your local elected official and say, you need to help me. Find him a government job. You don't have clean water, you immediately go to the government and help. So the idea that the government is front and center, that is clear. So one, people want to be in business and they want to stay in business, so they align with government. But there's a disposition to want to work with government across the society, across the sectors of society. And most philanthropists will say, we will only work with government in this part of the world. And there's some serious benefits there. One, like Paxachito said, you can scale in a way that you can never scale if it's just philanthropic capital. And I think James Chen, when he started his Clearly campaign by providing glasses to the people of Rwanda, but it really, eventually went to the United Nations, I believe, to get government support for these efforts so that the whole world can see more and have glasses. So the concept of working with government makes a lot of sense. And I think, as I said, governments want to work with philanthropists. Why? Because they provide risk capital, because they can pilot new ideas, and because they have more flexible money to be able to do things with.
Now, we briefly touched on this before about what governments can do to encourage more philanthropy. And in your view, what are the most effective levers?
Well, if you ask a philanthropist, does the tax subsidy matter to you or drive your decision about what, whether you're going to make a donation? I can guarantee you that 99.9% of the time they will say, of course not. I am doing this of the goodness of my heart. The tax subsidy or benefit has nothing to do with it. But it does matter. It does drive incentives. Why are DAFs so important in the United States now? Because of the tax benefit that they provide. So taxes put money back in the pockets of the philanthropists, and the country that has figured it out the most is actually in Asia. Singapore has a 250% subsidy for both individual and corporate donations, meaning for every dollar that somebody gives in Singapore, they can deduct $2.50 from their taxable income. That's the highest in the world. That is the government saying, we want you to engage in this way. Which brings up the second point. Taxes vary across Asia. In Hong Kong, it's very low, 15%. In many emerging markets, they're not great about collecting taxes, so it doesn't really matter. But what does matter is the messaging from government. We want you to do this. So the example that I like to give here is that during COVID, Prime Minister Modi in India created a philanthropic entity called PM Cares, Prime Minister Cares. It's a fund that was originally set up to address COVID. In India, if you give to Pratham or you give to Magic Bus or you give to other great nonprofits in India, you get a 50% tax benefit for making that gift. If you give to PM Cares, it's 100%.
Wow.
So what is the messaging there from the government? So people pay attention to that,
Yeah.
right? So I think that the messaging piece about taxes is important. Second, we are a big fan of government procurement programs. We think that when government procures the services from nonprofits and social enterprises, it increases the legitimacy of those entities. It puts money and funding in the pockets, in the coffers of those nonprofits and social enterprises, and it kind of creates win-wins. Which is the country in Asia where the government procures the most services? It's China. 73% of nonprofit organizations get government funding through procurement processes. The government in China has figured out how to work with the sector to get what the government of China needs. Now, people in the West can say that is the co-optation of the social sector in China, and I would say all the nonprofit leaders I know in China say, yeah, but so what? That's our reality, and now we can do our work and get funded for it too. The example that I really like is from Taiwan. There's a nonprofit started by a woman who was a paraplegic called Eden Social Welfare Group, Social Welfare Foundation. It has about a $40 million US budget a year, 20 million. It works on disability, it works on disability rights, it helps government think about, it advocates for the disabled, but it also provides programs and services for the disabled. 50% of their budget comes from government contracts, so they roll out services in schools, in public places, to help the disabled have access. So that's 50%. 25% comes from charitable donations, and 25% comes from the profits from social enterprises that employ those disabled people themselves. And that's 10 million US a year in profits from those social enterprises. So it's a great example of working with government, of kind of being nimble and solving a problem.
We've got just a few minutes left with Ruth. Have I got any questions from the audience? Yes, here in the front row. You do need a mic. It's coming to you.
Thanks very much. And Ruth, that was fascinating, and it's really eye-opening as well. And I really resonate with you, say, the regulatory barriers for moving the capital and the money between mainland China and Hong Kong. So before my time at Cambridge, I actually helped a UK-based foundation/NGO set up their office in Beijing, and took us more than 3 years to get all the paper done so they can receive money within China. So I think my question is actually related to that. There's lots of regulatory barriers to move money within the region, I mean Asia more broadly. But as you mentioned, lots of them are emerging markets, so they probably have similar challenges and social problems. For example, access to water, or social care, or housing issues. So my question is, money cannot flow easily, but how can we make sure the lessons learned and experience gained can be shared more broadly in this region? So then we don't create silos that every region try to do things in their own way, but not sharing with each other.
Well, I would say, thank you very much. Can I answer, or are you?
Just the second part is, who are, if is there anyone doing that already? That's my second part of the question. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I didn't plant this question. Actually, the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, CAPS, we do that. All of our publications are available for free. We disseminate very widely. we are all on YouTube. And we convene philanthropists and work with governments. We do it. But there are, what's happened in the past few years has been kind of a burst of interest in philanthropy. So you have PAA, which we talked about, coming out of Singapore. You have the Jockey Club which is now having a meeting every 2 years on philanthropy. You have AVPN, which meets every year on venture philanthropy, but moving capital toward doing good. So there's a lot of conferences around this. So conferences, there's publications. I think ours are the best, but there's some other ones. There's a lot more discussion and discourse around this. And I just want to say that there are a number of memes around the difference between first gen and second gen. And many say second gen cares more about impact. I don't know if I believe that, because it's not like they're hiring project evaluation teams to do that. But what is very true is second gen, the new gen, whatever it is, second or third, people under 50, and we did a study on this too, it's part of their identity of kind of being connected to community, that's part of the discourse that they have, that they talk about these things with their friends. So the currency of social interaction is becoming much more where people are talking about, I visited this village, I'm helping this, I fund this scholarship program, I help a women's cooperative. That is becoming more mainstreamed, and I think it's a really positive and exciting sign.
Ruth Shapiro, on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.